Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching the Awakening, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me just briefly introduce you to the Humanities Center. We are an institute for advanced study located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our main mission is to provide fellowships to scholars from this country and abroad who come to the center for an academic year to research and write on topics in things like history, literature and language, philosophy, literary criticism, that sort of thing. In addition, we offer a lot of programs and resources for teachers, high school teachers of American history and literature and art. You've already found our webinars, and you can find all of the other resources we offer high school teachers by going to americainclass.org. I think there you'll find some really interesting and innovative materials you can use with your students, and we urge you please to take a look at that. You can also go to our Pinterest page where we have aggregated a lot of resources from our own websites plus resources from other websites. I think there too you will find some really valuable material for your teaching. Now, when our seminar ends this evening, please go back to the Teaching the Awakening website. There you will find a recording of the webinar along with the PowerPoint, and please feel free to use the PowerPoint in your classes. That's what it's there for. You will also find an evaluation. We ask you to complete that evaluation and send it back to us. It's very important to us. And once we receive that, we will send you a letter documenting your participation in the webinar so that you can present it to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, our seminar leader, Jennifer Fleischner, tonight will be making some comments about the awakening, and we'll be stopping from time to time to analyze text and ask discussion questions. When we do, we hope you'll respond. Put your cursor in the box that you see in the lower right-hand corner. I've bracketed it there in green on the screen. Type your response, hit that send button, and it'll pop up in the chat box above, and I'll be monitoring that all night and bringing it into the conversation at appropriate moments. But please, don't wait for us to ask a question. If you have a question or a comment, please feel free to make those. As I say, I'll be bringing them into the conversation when I can. And remember, the golden rule of these webinars is that the more you participate, the better the webinar. So let's get underway. We have 4 questions that will frame our discussion this evening. To what exactly is Edna Pontellier awakening? What is the role of sexuality in her awakening? Why is her awakening associated over and over with the sea? Why is this book's final scene tragic but also lyrical? To lead us through those and other questions this evening, we have Jennifer Fleischner, who is an associate professor of English at Indiana University. In 2011 and 12, Jennifer was a fellow at the National Humanities Center, where she worked on a project that looked into the relationship between the humanities and neuroscience. In 2004, she wrote Women, Compulsion, and Modernity, the Moment of American Naturalism. So let me turn Jennifer's microphone on. As soon as I can figure out how to do it. There we go. Jennifer, awaken us to the awakening, please.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. This is my first time doing this. It's very exciting. So I don't know how much you know about Kate Chopin herself, but she had a fairly eventful, though sadly brief, life. She married quite young and had 6 children by the time she was 29. Her husband died shortly after that, and she had to take over his business, really in some ways leading the life of a man for a couple of years. Actually had an affair herself during that period. I don't think I got this onto the slide. But when her mother died soon after that, and she was stricken with grief, she turned to writing fiction, interestingly at the suggestion of her doctor, which might help us understand the Doctor and the Awakening a little better too. So The Awakening was published in 1899, and as some of you may know, it received quite a mixed response at the time. A lot of people found it very shocking. Sadly, she died quite shortly after that, and the work fell into oblivion for a very long time, but was resurrected beginning in the 1960s. And now, as you seem to evidence, many people teach it in high schools and colleges around the country. So, but I've always found it a very mysterious book, as well as a beautiful one. So I think there's a lot to be said about it. Tonight I'm going to be focusing a little bit, though I'm very happy to know what all of you have found when you've taught this in your classes and to share a little bit about what my students think as well. But I'll be focusing on some comments that Chopin made in an interview that she gave in 1894, so a little bit before this book was written. She spoke interestingly about the fact that she enjoyed the work of some of the scientific writers who were very popular at that time, and specifically those who were writing about evolution, Darwin, Huxley, and Spencer. So I'll read these quotes for you. The works of Darwin, Huxley, and Spencer were her daily companions, for the study of the human species, both general and particular, has always been her constant delight. She treats rather condescendingly a certain class of contemporary English women writers, whose novels are now the vogue. She calls them a lot of clever women gone wrong, and thinks that a well-directed course of scientific study might help to make clearer their vision, might anyhow bring them a little closer to nature, with whom at present they seem to have not even a bowing acquaintance. She has great respect for Mrs. Humphrey Ward's achievements, but Mrs. Ward is au fond, at the fundaments, a reformer, and such tendency in a novelist she considers a crime against good taste. Only the genius of a Dickens or a Thackeray can excuse it. So as you might imagine, these are striking quotes to me, and I would expect to many of you, because we think of this as a book that has a fairly powerful feminist message, and yet here is Chopin saying that she does not like texts that are too overt about having a political message. And the English women writers she's referring to were writing books that were very explicitly feminist in their intents. And she seems to suggest that if they read more Darwin, Huxley, and Spencer, they might write a different kind of book, which surprisingly enough might look a little more like The Awakening.
Jennifer, we have a good question. We have a good question here in the chat from Amelia. If Chopin was focused on scientific studies, should we consider her a naturalist versus a regional realist? I know she's often taught as kind of a local color writer. So does this move her, if not out of that regional frame, does it move her into a naturalistic frame?
I would like to make that argument, and I'm not the only one who has, but certainly in my book I try to treat Chopin as a naturalist. In general, women writers haven't often been thought of in that category, but I think as Chopin suggests, and this is true of Edith Wharton too, a lot of the women writers in this period were very interested in these evolutionary writings. So yes, I would absolutely suggest doing so.
Mm-hmm. So we should, as we teach Chopin, we should be looking for Darwinian ideas and ideas popularized by Huxley and Spencer.
Yes, I think that's right, although there are a lot of different ways of interpreting those ideas, and hopefully we can get to some of those this evening.
Okay.
But yes.
Cheryl writes, would you consider her a secular humanist? Now that's a very 20th and 21st century term, but do you see that being applied to her in retrospect?
I think that might be fair to say. I mean, she's certainly not a very religious writer, and the way that she thinks about nature, I think, would have seemed shocking from a religious perspective at the time she was writing.
Right. Well, Amelia apparently teaches across categories. She teaches Twain as both a naturalist and a regional writer as well. She suggests that Chopin and Twain would make an interesting pair. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea, actually. I was just teaching Huck Finn myself last week and thinking about, there's a kind of jaundiced view of a lot of human life, while at the same time, an idealism at the same time. So I think they'd go together well.
Yeah, she suggests the Twain story, The Lowest Animals. I never thought of Twain juxtaposing him with Darwin, but now, oh Lord, now that opens up a whole new field of inquiry. Well, shall we move ahead then?
Yes, I think we should. So here we are plunging into The Awakening and into the sea with Edna and Robert. What folly to bathe at such hour in such heat, exclaimed Mr. Pontellier. He himself had taken a plunge at daylight. That was why the morning seemed long to him. You are burnt beyond recognition, he added, looking at his wife as one looks at a valuable piece of personal property which has suffered some damage. She held up her hands, strong, shapely hands, and surveyed them critically, drawing up her fawn sleeves above the wrists. Looking at them reminded her of her rings, which she had given to her husband before leaving for the beach. She silently reached out to him, and he, understanding, took the rings from his vest pocket and dropped them into her open palm. She slipped them upon her fingers. So, what does this tell us about the relationship between Edna and her husband? I was saying to Richard, I often find that this early part of the book is a little easier to get into. Yes.
It really is. I've gone over this, and I know the questions that we've got coming up at the end. I'm really interested to see what our participants have to say about those, because I did not answer them to my own satisfaction. But this one I think I have a bead on. But let's see what our participants are going to say. It's always more interesting to hear what they have to say than what I've got to say, that's for sure. So we've got multiple. Okay. There's the obvious mention of personal property, but he's also scolding her like a child versus an equal. The author chooses to use the word property to describe how the husband sees his wife. Okay, we've got that. I think I would say that one of the things that struck me about this passage was she puts the rings back on her finger, which would suggest that she's, at this point in the novel at any rate, willingly accepting her role as a wife. See, Melissa is typing. We've got some more comments coming in. A whole bunch of people. The hierarchy in the relationship is clear, like the juxtaposition of a child with Edna's strength. He's pretty condescending to her. He treats her like a child. See what else we have. Another thing that struck me too was the two different views of. He is self-centered in the next section. We're getting a little bit ahead here. But you have two different views of Edna's body. He's looking at her body as property for him. Then she's looking at her body as something strong and shapely. Very different view. See what else we've got. I completely agree that he's treating her like a child, and she responds like a teen. I can imagine her rolling her eyes at him in response. Yet the hands are strong and shapely. I like the idea that she puts the rings on herself. Oh, this is an interpretation. Like she's applying manacles. Well, now that's interesting.
I think that's wonderful.
Yeah,
I think that's great.
Okay,
there's definitely
Jennifer, what do you make of these responses?
I think they're wonderful, and no, the idea of the rings as manacles is great. I mean, there's obviously a sense here that the rings are a kind of trap, and that the marriage is defined by this constraint and these constraining roles that they've learned to play, and that she herself is participating in, as you said, Richard. But I like the idea of her looking at her own hands almost as if for the first time, which she does elsewhere in the book also, and sort of seeing her body. And obviously here, oh no, she's been exposed to the sun. She shouldn't spend too much time out in the natural world. That will not do. But at the same time, she seems to be beginning to think differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was one of the her transgressions here, isn't it? I mean, at this time, women were valued on their fairness, and here she's coming back with a tan. That was not supposed to be done, right?
Yes, not the Southern lady. That's
right.
Quite an error.
Yeah.
Yes, and of course with a young man as well.
That's right. And Teresa writes, he holds and cares for the rings, though. And that, I think it's significant that he's got them tucked away in his vest pocket. That suggests where he's got his wife. So Cheryl writes, they got to be portly and fair-skinned equals rich. Okay, well, I think we've done a good job with that question, Jennifer. Anything else you'd like to point out about this particular passage?
I think we should move along. As I said, I feel like this book just gets more and more enigmatic as it proceeds. So I think we should set some things up here at the beginning and then really take the big plunge. So if we move along, do you want to read this one, Richard?
Sure. It would have been a difficult matter for Mr. Pontellier to define to his own satisfaction or anyone else's wherein his wife failed in her duty toward their children. It was something which he felt rather than perceived, and he never voiced the feeling without subsequent regret and ample atonement. If one of the little Pontellier boys took a tumble whilst at play, he was not apt to rush crying to his mother's arms for comfort. He would more likely pick himself up, wipe the water out of his eyes and the sand out of his mouth, and go on playing. Tots as they were, they pulled together and stood their ground in childish battles with doubled fists and uplifted voices, which usually prevailed against the other mother tots. The quadroon nurse was looked upon as a huge encumbrance, only good to button up waists and panties and to brush and part hair, since it seemed to be the law of society that hair must be parted and brushed. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was not a mother woman.
So I asked about this, what you might say about Edna's mode of mothering, and what is suggested by saying that to be a woman is not necessarily to be a mother woman. In fact, that to be a mother is not necessarily to be a mother woman. Maybe that's even more surprising.
Okay, that's going to be a big theme in the novel, the way she mothers. So how would you judge her mothering out there? And let me ask while the participants are responding, do we see a little survival of the fittest here with those Pontellier boys? Is that a Spencerian idea creeping into the play yard?
Could be. Like the little lion cubs.
To finish up the discussion we were having earlier, Chanel writes, at the beginning of the story, she doesn't seem to question her role. She just seems to float social conventions. And I think the verb float there is significant. We're going to come up against floating quite a bit later on. But Amelia writes, this characterization seems more like the mother-child relationship of today. She has a life outside of caring for her children. She's a working mom versus a stay-at-home mom. Cheryl notes that she is detached. Melissa writes, Edna's mode of mothering is modern. Her children are independent. Susan writes, perhaps she is a mother in the sense of preparing her children for the future, but not coddling them. Mother tots now often carry a negative connotation, mama's boys.
That's a very nice point. Yes, that's exactly, yes, that change really does seem to have taken place. And it's true, I mean, as some readers have pointed out, right, there's even a nanny here. So, I mean, that's modern in some ways too. The role of these servant characters in this book would merit an entire other webinar. They're actually portrayed fairly interestingly, though not at this moment where the kids just see the nurse as a nuisance. But I think it's important to our understanding of Edna as a mother that she is floating above it, as one of the respondents said, and she's not necessarily participating so much. So the question of why motherhood seems a huge encumbrance to her later in the book is something that we might think about.
Was her attitude toward her children one of the things that raised critical ire in 1899?
That's interesting. I don't think so. I think it was really the sexuality. And yet, to me, in some ways, I feel that Chopin is more radical in terms of the way she talks about motherhood. It was very hard for people to get past the idea of a married woman having an affair. That was the sort of thing that you found in French novels, not American ones.
That's French. Amelia writes, her husband seems to be annoyed by her detachment in the same way we get annoyed by shows like Teen Mom, where they consider their children as accessories. Teresa writes, yes. It's interesting that the children stood their ground with double fists and uplifted voices, and yet she seems more passive. That's an interesting contrast. Chanel writes, the Pontellier children just seem to be objects in the story. They just exist with little interaction or affection for them. And Cheryl notes, all they want is sweets. So, yeah, it's definitely not a children's book. The children are never terribly well-developed characters. There is a kind of almost a prop value to them, but this isn't really their story.
It's true, but those are good comments. I mean, I think on the one hand, it's refreshing. Another book that I was teaching recently is Uncle Tom's Cabin, and, so much 19th century American literature kind of exalts the child, in this extremely sentimental way. So to have a novel where, at the dinner party, there's the moment where you send the kids off and finally we can have an adult conversation. I mean, that's refreshing in the context of 19th century American literature, but I don't think that we have to simply like the view of Edna that we get here. I mean, I don't know what you all have found, but my students are often quite ambivalent toward her, and this might be one of those moments. Yeah.
Well, Cheryl writes here a good point in terms of the tone of the novel. If the kids were sweet, we would blame Edna for the ending. So the children... We ourselves, the readers, have to be somewhat detached from the
That's
children. Right. Chanel writes, it makes it easy for us to sympathize with her attitude toward them. And Jennifer writes, very little attention from either parent. The father is proud to have two boys. I wonder what his comment would have been if they'd been girls. Yeah, so that's true. If she'd made a lot of the children in the novel, then our whole perception of the ending would be quite different. But that ending is still I'm still baffled by it. I'm eager to hear what everyone has to say about it.
Me too. Well, we could move on to the next one. So here we'll have a mother woman. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was not a mother woman. The mother women seemed to prevail that summer at Grand Isle. It was easy to know them, fluttering about with extended protecting wings when any harm, real or imaginary, threatened their precious brood. They were women who idolized their children, worshipped their husbands, and esteemed it a holy privilege to efface themselves as individuals and grow wings as ministering angels. Many of them were delicious in the role. One of them was the embodiment of every womanly grace and charm. If her husband did not adore her, he was a brute, deserving of death by slow torture. Her name was Adele Ratignolle. There are no words to describe her, save the old ones that have served so often to picture the bygone heroine of romance and the fair lady of our dreams. There was nothing subtle or hidden about her charms. Her beauty was all there, flaming and apparent. The spun gold hair that comb nor confining pin could restrain, the blue eyes that were like nothing but sapphires, two lips that pouted that were so red one could only think of cherries or some other delicious crimson fruit in looking at them. So I asked if this description of Adele was perhaps somewhat surprising. The mother women are said to efface themselves. Does she seem like she does?
Okay, well, we're waiting for comments. Merrill makes a really good point here. He says, I must be missing something. This seems to me to be a very white Southern way of raising children. Children should be seen and not heard and raised by the mammy. So have we made more of Edna's detachment from her children? Is this just a feature of regional writing, particularly upper class writing, where you would have servants in the South? Or upper class?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, when I hear that, that sounds right, and yet the story obviously treats most of the women as kind of obsessively mothering. I almost wonder if it's almost like a 20th century, like new sort of sense, of the mother role, that it would not involve servants, but I really don't know.
Yeah.
That's a great question to ask.
Well, here she does talk about the women seeing their children as a precious brood. So that suggests that other mother women are much closer to their children. And I see here we've got the image of the bird protecting wings when any harm, real or imaginary, threatened. And then in the last scene, we have the bird with a broken wing plunging into the water.
Right.
So let's say our participants are still writing here. Are these descriptions from the narrator supposed to be Edna's perceptions? How would you respond to that, Jennifer?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing with this book in general. I mean, Chopin uses this kind of free and direct discourse way of writing where it's very hard to know at times whether Edna is thinking or the narrator. And this seems more like the narrator, in part, I guess, because we often see Edna from a slight distance also. But I also imagine these are things that Edna herself might say about Adele. And she seems drawn to her.
Yeah, it's baffling later on, too. In the last scene, when she's walking to the beach, the narrator rehearses a whole bunch of things that you think Edna is thinking about, but then the narrator comes at the very end and says, but she wasn't thinking those things. So
right.
Yeah, I was really, really thrown here. Let's see, we have some other comments. Question, is this poking at romantic writing and ideas? I think it is surprising that Adele is described as physically beautiful, while at the same time, to be an ideal mother, not usually a role combined with physical beauty. Adele seems to be described almost as a flat character, nothing subtle or hidden in her charms. Adele seems to be an actual angel. She's the prototype for the mother woman, and Edna seems to try at points to be like her. She seems like a person that Edna would admire because of her looks and how Adele is seen by the community. And Edna seems old, but she's only supposed to be 28. That's an interesting comment. So what do you make of those responses to Adele?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think a flat character might be a little too strong, but I mean, I can see why it is poking fun, obviously, at a romantic way of writing. At the same time, as the one comment suggests, I mean, the emphasis on her body is surprising for somebody who, is the mother figure who, would be all about caring and nurturing and not about any kind of sensuality or sexuality. You see those things in Adele, and to me, that is surprising. I would have expected those things to come up in the description of Edna, but the other women would be fading into the background. Mm-hmm. So to me, this is sort of the first mystery to unfold, which is something that I like to try to find in books and encourage my students to, what are the moments where you stop and say, wait a second, there's something more to be figured out here. So.
Well, Pat Marshall writes that her students often read this as satiric in tone, and certainly the first paragraph, I don't know about satiric, it's certainly sort of mocking. Mm-hmm. How would you respond to that? Do you see satire here?
The first paragraph does seem very satirical. And then, the description of Adele, I guess especially because Edna is so drawn to her in a way that almost is physical in the scene where they sit on the beach. I can't quite see the second one as quite as fully satirical only. There does seem to be a way in which Adele really is this kind of overflowing, rich figure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think in response to our second question there, does she efface herself? Our narrator tells us that she doesn't. There was nothing subtle or hidden about her charms. Her beauty was all there, right? Flaming and apparent. So no, I don't think Adele is effacing herself. But we're going to see Adele's her own sexuality, or particular maternal sort of sexuality, arise later on in the novel. So shall we move ahead?
Yeah, because this does play into those same questions. So this again, just to try to complicate the idea that Edna is the liberated woman and Adele is the conventional woman, because I think this book shows us those subjects in a somewhat more complicated way. So Adele was always talking about her condition. Her condition was in no way apparent, and no one would have known anything about it but for her persistence in making it the subject of conversation. Robert started to reassure her, asserting that he had known a lady who had subsisted upon nougat during the entire, but seeing the color mount into Mrs. Pontellier's face, he checked himself and changed the subject. Mrs. Pontellier, though she had married a Creole, was not thoroughly at home in the society of Creoles. Never before had she been thrown so intimately among them. A characteristic which distinguished them and which impressed Mrs. Pontellier most forcibly was their entire absence of prudery. Their freedom of expression was at first incomprehensible to her, though she had no difficulty in reconciling it with a lofty chastity which in the Creole woman seems to be inborn and unmistakable. So again, doesn't it seem surprising here that Edna is the one who's more shocked by talk of sex and the body than the more conventional women, the mother women around her, seem to be? And this comes up in another moment where they pass around a kind of racy novel, a French novel, in fact, and Edna's the one who blushes at the idea of reading it.
Mm-hmm. So what do we make of that? Is it surprising to you that Edna is more shocked by the talk of sex and the body than the more conventional women around her? I think this may play into the kind of image of the Creole and the local color image of the sultry Gulf Coast and New Orleans. Does that figure into this here, Jennifer, do you think?
That's certainly true, and it's certainly the French background in particular. But at the same time, if one were to go, in that direction, then you would want to say something like, oh, sexuality is just the norm, and so then how is Edna revolting at all, by having an affair? So I think it's this odd combination where there's very frank, open talk about these things, but this lofty chastity at the same time. Mm-hmm. That seems like the thing we need to understand.
Mm-hmm. Could we see this shock as the beginning of the awakening in Edna? A very good question. So is this shock the beginning of the awakening?
Well, it may be. That's an interesting question. I'm not completely sure I see it that way. I mean, I guess to me, it might help to go on to the next quote to answer that question fully.
But before we do, we have a comment from Melissa. Sexuality seems to be centered around childbirth and motherhood, which takes the sex out of sexuality.
That's fair, though the French novel that everybody passes around is in no way just about motherhood. That's just a sexy book. So you're right. I mean, it's obviously Adele's not messing around with anybody, and she's talking about being pregnant. But yeah, that was still not something you would find New Englanders talking about.
Probably
in the
not.
1890s.
No, it doesn't appear in Hawthorne, that's for sure. So shall we move ahead then?
So yeah, because I mean, I think the question about Edna's awakening beginning here is interesting. I mean, I think part of what's going on is that it seems important to me that the book shows you in Adele a version of, sex talk or body talk that's already out there and that doesn't really have any disruptive meaning. In fact, it goes along very comfortably with this perfect chastity that no one would ever question. So Adele can flirt with Robert and nobody worries about it. So to really think about these things in the transgressive way that Edna will require thinking about them in a different way.
Should I read this one to save your voice?
Yeah, sure.
In short, Mrs. Pontellier was beginning to realize her position in the universe as a human being and to recognize her relations as an individual to the world within and about her. This may seem like a ponderous weight of wisdom to descend upon the soul of a young woman of 28, perhaps more wisdom than the Holy Ghost is usually pleased to vouchsafe to any woman. But the beginning of things, of a world especially, is necessarily vague, tangled, chaotic, and exceedingly disturbing. How few of us ever emerge from such a beginning. How many souls perish in the tumult. The voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander for a spell in abysses of solitude, to lose itself in mazes of inward contemplation. The voice of the sea speaks to the soul. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. Well, okay. Shall we go to our discussion question? Why is Edna's awakening associated with the sea? And maybe here, Jennifer, would you say here we're really beginning to see the beginning of her awakening? We've got that word beginning right there in the first sentence.
Yes, yeah. And I think that the sea is there right from the beginning is important. So that's part of what I mean about the way in which her awakening, I think we're all tempted, and certainly students are, to see it as about certain kinds of forbidden behaviors, but it seems like it's more a certain view of the world that's opening up to her.
Amelia writes, the mention of the Holy Ghost makes me think of baptism, which uses water to symbolize rebirth. Branches the ocean portrays all souls as being carried to land by the sea. That's an interesting point. I focused on the Holy Ghost, and I was wondering how that fit in. That's an interesting point. Merrill writes the sea is elemental. Getting back to a little whiff of Darwin there, perhaps because the sea is mysterious and can be seen in so many different lights. Okay.
Yeah, these are wonderful answers. I think especially at this early point, it's very hard for us to know, and I think to have those ideas on the table already is great.
Well, the first time I read this, I took that. Realizing her position in the universe, I thought that was kind of, self-empowerment, and she was finding her identity. But now, when you juxtapose that with a Darwinian notion of how humans figure into the universe, we don't play much of a role in the universe. We're ciphers. It's not. We're not the privileged creatures we think. So that gives an entirely different spin to what she might be realizing here. And of course, the sea, being engulfing and indifferent and massive, might underscore that notion. Susan writes, I think the sea is also deep, mysterious, and the depths not readily understood. This would fit with Darwin's theory and her reading of it. Life is coming from the primordial sludge down there in Louisiana.
Yes.
I think the sea is reminiscent of Edna's journey during her awakening. It seems ever-changing and unpredictable. Yeah, that does certainly reflect her character. Full immersion, baptism, I think, represents descending into death and re-emerging, rising again into life. What do you think of these responses, Jennifer? Are we
Wonderful.
on the right track here to see a little bit of
Yes.
Darwin behind this? And before we get to that, the sea is fiercely gendered element. The sea isn't a fiercely gendered element either. Her awakening has aspects of male and female. Some interesting comments there, Jennifer. How would you respond?
Yeah, those are wonderful. No, and then the Holy Ghost baptism comment makes me think of giving birth in water. And yes, and Aphrodite rises from the water, but that's right. Most sea stories are very masculine stories. So I think it does, as in the idea of the primordial element where all things arise from, that male and female would be combined here in some way. And your comment too, Richard, I think is very, very important that this book is probably most often read as, finding her identity, right? We think about the idea of a feminist awakening in those terms now, and yet in some ways, if we think back of that first scene where she's putting the rings back on, that's her identity, right? Her identity is to be Mrs. Pontellier. So as we see in a book where at the end she's going to strip off all her clothes, it's almost more about losing identity that's
Mm-hmm.
been given and opening oneself up to something that's more impersonal in a lot of ways.
Now I'm going to reveal my my ignorance here of Darwinian thinking, but how does Darwin conceive the beginning of the world? She talks about here at the beginning of things, of a world especially vague, tangled, chaotic, and exceedingly disturbing. That are we right there in seeing, as one of our participants had mentioned, the primordial sea, out of which the creatures came and evolved?
Yeah,
Again,
yeah,
do we see Darwin's
yes,
hand behind that?
absolutely. Definitely. No, I think that idea, yes, of the sea as at the beginning of things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, a different way of thinking about life than the religious story.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Yeah.
Melissa brings that religious story back in. I also like the beginning of things, which calls up Genesis. Is she using biblical imagery and Darwinian imagery side by side for a reason? That's
Hmm.
a good point. You've got the Holy Ghost, certainly not Darwinian, but then you have that primordial sea and a human being realizing her position in the universe. What do you make of that juxtaposition?
Well, that's very interesting because Edna is also finding throughout this book, the scales sort of fall from her eyes, right? She sees things as they are. And so that could be, like eating the fruit of knowledge, certainly. So that kind of beginning of things is the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of being human.
So we're seeing
Not an
the
Eden-like beginning.
Uh, so we're seeing the
Sorry.
beginning of her awakening here. So we'll be getting on to the first of our framing questions: to what is Edna awakening? So we move ahead. Shall I read this one too to help you save your voice?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Of whom? Of what are you thinking? Asked Adele. Nothing, returned Mrs. Pontellier with a start, adding at once, how stupid. But it seems to me it is the reply we make instinctively to such a question. Let me see. Oh, never mind, laughed Madame Ratignolle. It is really too hot to think, especially to think about thinking. But for the fun of it, persisted Edna. First of all, the sight of the water stretching so far away, those motionless sails against the blue sky, made a delicious picture that I just wanted to sit and look at. The hot wind beating in my face made me think, without any connection that I can trace, of a summer day in Kentucky, of a meadow that seemed as big as the ocean, to the very little girl walking through the grass, which was higher than her waist. She threw out her arms as if swimming when she walked, beating the tall grass as one strikes out in the water. Oh, I see the connection now. Where were you going that day in Kentucky, walking through the grass? I don't remember now. I was just walking diagonally across a big field. My sunbonnet obscured the view. I could see only the stretch of green before me, and I felt as if I must walk on forever without coming to the end of it. I don't remember whether I was frightened or pleased. I must have been entertained. But do you know, sometimes I feel this summer as if I were walking through the green meadow again, idly, aimlessly, unthinking, and unguided. Okay. So our question
Yeah.
now, what kind of memory is this, and how can Edna experience that Grand Isle be connected to it? Okay. Any comments on that, Jennifer? I want to help us lead into this while our participants are responding.
Well, I think all the things people were saying about the sea could really help us to think about this
Mm-hmm.
memory. Adele doesn't really want to know the depths of what Edna may be thinking, but when Edna really tries for the first time to look into herself, which the narrator tells us she rarely does, again, it's not that she discovers some hidden impulse she didn't know she had, or some clearly scandalous thought or other self that she needs to become. She gets this image, this very specific memory,
Mm-hmm.
the meaning of which is not at all immediately clear. And again, that's what makes it so fascinating to me. It's so evocative.
Yeah, well, you can see the relationship between a field of grass and the ocean. I mean, I get that. They're two, vast expanses. But I do have to say that the way the relationship plays out later on was really baffling to me. Teresa writes, she is just going through the motions with no end in sight. I think that no end in sight is important. Amelia is typing in. One thing that struck me about this, too, was that when she was in the memory, she remembers a sunbonnet obstructing her view, and she's walking diagonally across the big field as if she were following a path. But now, there's nothing obstructing her view. Now she sees the whole field just as she sees the ocean. So I wonder,
Yes.
I was trying to figure that one out. But Amelia, in the meantime, writes, the book mentions that she notices that she has always been prone to fits of sadness. Maybe this is meant to tell us that she has always been on the cusp of this awakening, that she has always known her place in the universe, but only just realized it.
Yes. But it's interesting. She says doesn't know if she was frightened or pleased. She must have been entertained. So, I mean, there's something about this going on and on and on and not having a goal and just, being open to the wind and the sky and the sun and the grass, which is, very compelling to her at this moment. I think I wouldn't call it going through the motions just because that has such a connotation of habit.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like in some ways going through the motions is to have a kind of story that you know the end in advance. And this is what it looks like to not have a story yet, like the little girl.
Well, would we be pushing things too far to see a little bit of the non-teleological Darwinian worldview here?
I don't think so. But that's probably not surprising. But yes, that's right. I mean, even the sense that, that things are simply moving forward, and we don't know where they came from or where they're going, but they're constantly unfolding and moving. That's the one thing we can say. Everything is always undergoing a process of ceaseless change.
And there's no plan. Things are idle, aimless, unthinking, and unguided. Dave writes, it seems interesting that she also remembers that she was running away from prayers, as prayers filled with the spirit of gloom, as she rejects the religion of her childhood. She seems to open to all sorts of other experiences. And Merrill writes, the bonnet does not let her see around her just straight ahead like blinkers on a horse. Amelia writes, I also like the idea that she's seeing the vastness. She realizes that there's more to life than what she sees. Mm-hmm. So, can we, at this point, Jennifer, do you feel confident about addressing our first question? Maybe we could put that out there to people. How would you frame precisely what she is awakening to? Our first framing question: to what is Edna awakening?
Well, I think we can give a first answer to that now, and I do think it shifts a little bit as the book goes on. I don't think we have the negative sense of it that we get later, or that it has any negative aspects. Right now, it just feels like an opening to more of life than daily habits and routines allow, and that is this picture of something like the Darwinian universe is one way to think about it, but just the water, the wind, the sky, all these things for their own sakes, just which at this moment seem beautiful and exciting, limitless, I guess is the word I would associate with it.
Okay, so it's not exactly a romantic sense of abandoning boundaries and wiping out limits. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's not. I mean, there are different connotations of the word romantic, but it's certainly not, transcendent. It's very rooted in ordinary, daily, earthy things. I mean, that's why the sunbonnet is interesting, right? She's seeing less, but then she can only see the green grass, and that becomes a universe. So, I mean, I guess it's romantic in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, shall we move ahead then?
Yeah. This will now get more complex yet in a different way. So this is just an interesting detail about Edna that's easy to overlook. Edna often wondered at one propensity which sometimes had inwardly disturbed her without causing any outward show or manifestation on her part. At a very early age, perhaps it was when she traversed that ocean of waving grass, she remembered that she had been passionately enamored of a dignified and sad-eyed cavalry officer who visited her father in Kentucky. She could not leave his presence when he was there, nor remove her eyes from his face, which was something like Napoleon's, with a lock of black hair falling across his forehead. But the cavalry officer melted imperceptibly out of her existence. She was a grown young woman when she was overtaken by what she supposed to be the climax of her fate. It was when the face and figure of a great tragedian began to haunt her imagination and stir her senses. The persistence of the infatuation lent it an aspect of genuineness. The hopelessness of it colored it with the lofty tones of a great passion. The acme of bliss, which would have been a marriage with the tragedian, was not for her in this world. As the devoted wife of a man who worshipped her, she felt she would take her place with a certain dignity in the world of reality, closing the portals forever behind her upon the realm of romance and dreams. But it was not long before the tragedian had gone to join the cavalry officer and the engaged young man and a few others, and Edna found herself face to face with the realities. She grew fond of her husband, realizing with some unaccountable satisfaction that no trace of passion or excessive and fictitious warmth colored her affection, thereby threatening its dissolution. So Edna seems to have been prone to a few childhood infatuations. Are they a sign that she is a hopeless romantic? There's actually a famous book review of The Awakening by Willa Cather, who did not sign her name to it at the time and had not yet become the Willa Cather we know, but that was essentially her diagnosis of Edna. She's just the kind of person who thinks life is going to be more romantic than it really ever is and just has to kind of snap out of it. Why is she glad rather than upset that her marriage is not based on this kind of passion?
This is where things really do get baffling, and I hope our participants can illuminate me here. Cheryl writes she's unlucky in love, makes readers feel sympathy for her. So as not to blame her for the ending, and that memory, that image of the grass and the cavalry officer, they come back to her as she's swimming in the last scene. She wants to see her romance with Robert as a grand romance. Let's see, we've got some more comments coming in. This is that last sentence is kind of hard to square with what happens in the novel. She grew fond of her husband, realizing some unaccountable satisfaction. There was no trace of passion, threatening its dissolution, and of course, it does dissolve. I mean, she leaves him, so that. Yes.
I guess she means how she feels about him.
Yeah.
Is not too passionate too. But it seems here that passion is not something you want in a marriage.
But she clearly wants passion. I mean, the memory of the grass is associated with desire. I mean, the cavalry officer there, she was deeply, passionately enamored of him, I think. She's glad because she looks at her passionate infatuation as unreal and transitory, while her passionless marriage is solid and real. Let's see, Chopin's husband died when she was 32, so maybe there's a little autobiography in there. Her partnership with her husband seems to be the reality she wants to accept. And Melissa writes, her childhood romances are one-sided. Léonce seems to be the first to care for her. It's sad that she thinks being responsible means denying romance. Maybe she wants to keep her romances in the fairy tale realm. Marriage is not for fairy tales, no romance, so it can last and remain in the real world. So we've got this tension between romance and reality. This one baffles me.
But I like these comments because, again, they do get at the complexity of Edna as a character that, one might be impatient with her at moments. And, I mean, it was mentioned earlier that there was something potentially satirical in the description of Adele, that students point that out. And, to me, the girlish Edna is being laughed at gently a little bit here. I mean, the idea of the acme of bliss, right, would have been to marry, basically this actor, right? It's like she's, in love with Brad Pitt or something like that, and thinks, when I become Mrs. Brad Pitt, my life is going to be perfect and wonderful. And so it's interesting to think about that version of romance versus, if we would want to call it romantic, what we get from The Walk Across the Field, which has much less obvious content attached to it. But this is kind of the fairy tale version. And you would get this absolute happiness through the perfect love. And I didn't get to focus so much on this, but it would be worth asking students and thinking about to what extent she repeats some of this, as someone said, in her relationship with Robert.
Okay, well, shall we move ahead and
Yeah.
see how this plot thickens here?
Yes, we need to get music in here, because the other main female character in the book, Mademoiselle Rice, is of course an accomplished pianist. And so, yeah, here she is playing for Edna, and Edna has a different kind of experience than she's had before.
Shall I read this one?
Yes, yeah.
The very first chords which Mademoiselle Rice struck upon the piano sent a keen tremor down Mrs. Pontellier's spinal column. It was not the first time she had heard an artist at the piano. Perhaps it was the first time she was ready. Perhaps for the first time her being was tempted to make an impress of the abiding truth. She waited for the material pictures which she thought would gather and blaze before her imagination. She waited in vain. She saw no pictures of solitude, of hope, of longing, or of despair, but the very passions themselves were aroused within her soul, swaying it, lashing it as the waves daily beat upon her splendid body. She trembled, she was choking, and the tears blinded her. In our discussion question, Edna expects a kind of pleasure from the music, but she experiences something else. It is not simply pleasurable, or not simply the opposite. How would you characterize it? So, really eager to hear what our participants have to say about what's going on in this scene. This is another one that I'm not at all sure about. So we've got Amelia writing in. What did strike me about this was the distinction between what she anticipated and what actually happened to her.
Yes.
So let's see what our participants have to say. Is that a useful distinction to make here, Jennifer,
Very
between
much.
what she hopes and what happens?
Yes, and there's even elsewhere a description of how she has these little names that she gives to pieces, and particular, which again, I mean, there's a slight sense of making fun of that would be too strong, but finding it an amusing thing that she does.
Well, this would suggest that in response to the previous question, that she is a hopelessly romantic. She's waiting to have kind of programmed responses. But Madame Rice's music is so overpowering that it really touches her in a more raw and visceral and immediate way.
Yes, I think that's right. Which turns out to be, almost overwhelming. I mean, she's overcome. It's wonderful, but it's also somewhat frightening.
Mm-hmm. So Susan writes, I think the music evokes so many passions depending on a person's mood, state of mind at a particular time. Amelia writes, I love that when Mademoiselle leaves, she describes Edna as the only worthy listener. She lets herself connect to the music and be moved. She connects while the others only acknowledge that there is music. Her connection here reminds me of her conversation with Adele about the field she's trying to share, but she can't. Interesting comment. What would you make? How would you respond to that, Jennifer?
No, I like that very much. I think that's a theme really throughout the book. I sometimes think of that song that Robert sang to her. Ah, si tu savais, if you knew. I mean, there is some sense that there is some unknowability at the heart of who we all are that Edna is also waking up to. So that's, again, somewhat cut against the idea of, her finding herself, as if that were a clear-cut thing. And she lived happily ever after.
Meryl makes a good point. She was expecting the visual, which is the processing of something outside of her. Instead, she is affected within herself. Her internal feelings become entwined with the music and respond to it. Yeah, that's a good point. She was expecting something from the outside, and she gets it from the inside. Yeah.
Yes. She really lives it.
Well, what at this moment in her life would make her susceptible to these kind of responses? That's a question that baffled me throughout.
It seems that a number of things are working on her simultaneously. I mean, I'm not sure there really is one
Mm-hmm.
answer to that question. I mean, I think a lot of people, as the reviewers show, read the book, and the sexual awakening, the influence of Robert was the key, to answering that question. And it's important. I mean, but I guess the one would want to ask, and it's a difficult thing for students to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about sex in the classroom. Certainly, college students don't. I'm sure it's even worse in high school. But what does it mean to say that she was sexually awakened? I mean, I think for Chopin that could be a profound thing. It's not just physical pleasure. It's who am I as a being, as an animal, as you were saying, about the Darwinian side of it, that she's open to all of these sensual possibilities in the world, and to music as a vehicle for passion, not just a cute little song. I mean, all these things do seem to form a kind of very, very lumpy whole,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but not a straightforward one.
No, and we have no backstory regarding her marriage to Léonce, do we? I mean, he's just there. I mean, the novel opens and he's married and they're married.
It's nothing terrible, right? I mean, I think it's supposed to be very conventional.
Mm-hmm.
He sends her the candy, and all the wives say he's the greatest.
Mm-hmm. But there's no indication of why she married him. I mean, that we don't see their courting or anything like that.
No, that's true. I mean, there is some sense that she thought she had these grand loves that were never to be, and so she sucked it up and did what she was supposed to do. I mean, there are interesting pieces of criticism that talk about her being 28, and connecting this to the cycles of the moon, right? And I don't know, Adele's pregnancy. I mean, you can do all kinds of interesting stuff about time and the body in the book. But
it is New Orleans, but voodoo.
Who knows? It is. Yeah.
For all we know. Pat Marshall writes, prior to her awakening, Edna seems more focused on how she should respond or be as she awakens, and then she awakens to how she does feel. That's I think that's a very well put.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so too. Yes, there's an honesty of response which is shocking even to her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, shall we go ahead? I think we're moving into the ocean again. Shall I?
Yes, we are.
Read this one for you?
Please do.
Edna had attempted all summer to learn to swim. A certain ungovernable dread hung about her when in the water, unless there was a hand nearby that might reach out and reassure her. But that night she was like the little, tottering, stumbling, clutching child who of a sudden realizes its powers and walks for the first time alone, boldly and with overconfidence. She could have shouted for joy. She did shout for joy, as with a sweeping stroke or two she lifted her body to the surface of the water. A feeling of exultation overtook her, as if some power of significant import had been given her to control the working of her body and her soul. She grew daring and reckless, overestimating her strength. She wanted to swim far out where no woman had swum before. She turned her face seaward to gather in an impression of space and solitude, which the vast expanse of water, meeting and melting with the moonlit sky, conveyed to her excited fancy. As she swam, she seemed to be reaching out for the unlimited in which to lose herself. Once she turned and looked toward the shore, toward the people she had left there. Quick vision of death smote her soul, and for a second of time appalled and enfeebled her senses. But by an effort she rallied her staggering faculties and managed to regain the land. And our question, why is this experience of swimming presented to us, like the music, like the awakening itself, both exciting and potentially overwhelming, even terrifying? So we have Merrill writing here, Edna feels and is aware of her own power and her control of her own powers. Yeah, this obviously is the first time she's felt that way. Jennifer, how would you respond to that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the sense that she can do something powerful with her body, that when she enters this powerful element, the sea, which we've already seen, she's not simply lost in a kind of abyss, but she can move, she can swim, she can find some kind of a home there. Exhilarating.
Uh-huh. Amelia finds this scene particularly effective. I love the idea of the unlimited in which to lose herself. This, more than perhaps any other scene, makes me imagine her on the cusp of some great truth. Susan writes,
Yes.
she is also aware that she is not completely in control of herself and of the world around her. This is exciting and frightening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's those both seem just right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think the reaching out for the unlimited is both a physical, almost a spiritual experience she's having, but at the same time, it is a kind of knowledge. But, there is the shore and there are the people, and she's part of that world too. And when seen from the point of view of them, this world of the unlimited is, it's inhuman and therefore frightening.
But isn't that also a romantic idea? I mean, is she here trying to transcend in some way, going for the unlimited?
I think it is. I think it is. But part of that, I mean, this is the first place in the book, I think, where we see that part of that is linked to death in some way. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, to really reach the unlimited, would be to go beyond everything that she knows and the world as she knows it. Um,
Merrill
so,
writes, it's frightening to be aware that Edna is in control, but also scary because Edna realizes that she is the person responsible. Edna is aware.
yes.
Melissa writes, the desire to be a trailblazer, to swim far out, is exciting and terrifying. Amelia writes, yeah, her portrayal of the ocean has always made me think of Emerson's Nature. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think of that connection? Emerson raises his head here.
Yeah. No, I think that, I mean, it's true that Edna herself reads Emerson later in the book and seems to fall asleep over Emerson, so I never know if that's some clue to Kate Chopin not being completely an Emerson fan. But no, in terms of his ideas, I think that's very easy to imagine. And that's an interesting thing about her writing in the late 19th century, that she has some transcendentalist inclinations. But I guess I'd be tempted to emphasize that there is also something earthier about Chopin and Edna and, the role of sexuality, even that it's from a woman's point of view. It's not simply the philosophical view of these matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's living it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a comment, no, that the comment about the responsibility, though, I think is very important. I mean, when she looks back to the people she had left there, makes me think of that, think of the children at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then a quick vision of death smote her soul for a second of time. She appalled and enfeebles her senses, and then she comes back.
Yes.
Okay, well, shall we move ahead then?
Yes, we shall. So this
Okay, I mean,
was, yeah, I mean, I wanted to get us toward the end of the book, and obviously we're skipping over vast portions of it, so if people want to bring those in, please do. But I tried to sum up a lot of days of Edna's in this very short quote. There were days when she was very happy without knowing why. She was happy to be alive and breathing, when her whole being seemed to be one with the sunlight, the color, the odors, the luxuriant warmth of some perfect southern day. She liked then to wander alone into strange and unfamiliar places. She discovered many a sunny, sleepy corner fashioned to dream in, and she found it good to dream and to be alone and unmolested. There were days when she was unhappy, she did not know why, when it did not seem worthwhile to be glad or sorry, to be alive or dead, when life appeared to her like a grotesque pandemonium, and humanity like worms struggling blindly toward inevitable annihilation. She could not work on such a day, nor weave fancies to stir her pulses and warm her blood. So are both of these kinds of days the result of Edna's awakening? How can we account for it producing such opposing reactions? And is that the Darwinian strain in the book?
okay. Good question. We have several people typing in here. A swing of emotions. She needs some mood medicine. Maybe a little Prozac or
Yeah, exactly. Level
Xanax or
around.
something. Yeah,
Maybe
level
so.
out those peaks and valleys there. That might. Uh, let's see
Well,
what
Leonce
else.
actually almost has that reaction, right? He says, to the doctor, she's not well. I think if there had been Prozac around, he would have prescribed it.
Pat Marshall writes, of course, we cannot know what is absent until we are aware of what surrounds us. Knowledge is empowering, but the lack of ability to act on that knowledge can be enfeebling. Okay. Any other comments out there? I was particularly struck. Again, I'm seeing Darwin behind every sand dune here, but um, we have her the life again, kind of non-guided. No overall design, grotesque pandemonium, and humanity like worms struggling blindly toward inevitable annihilation. I mean, those, and we can see some Darwinian ideas there. I'm not entirely sure about that first paragraph, though. Is Darwin in any way lurking behind that?
Well, in the sense, this is, in some ways, the first part to me is almost more surprising than the second, maybe because I'm so used to thinking about what's in the second one. But the first one, if it's a description of what Edna's awakening looks like when it's going well, that again, it's almost like the walk through the meadow, right? It's not saying, and then she discovered that she didn't have to be a wife all day. She could paint, or, some activity, something where she was really fulfilling herself. It's much more that she's alive and almost, discovering a sunny, sleepy corner, like a cat, wandering off into the sun and just drinking it all in. And so the wandering seems to be what's stressed in both of these. And so in the first of them, that's wonderful. There's a kind of absolute openness and possibility to having that unlimitedness, that story that has no end, that just goes on and on. Mm-hmm. And then the flip side of that is the darker vision of the same thing in the second paragraph.
Merrill writes, I feel that this is more transcendentalist than Darwinian. When alone in nature, she is happy. When surrounded or thinking about human beings, she is miserable. And Amelia writes, the first paragraph is like the sudden desire to see her children or the sudden doting on her husband. Pat writes, and she is aware of what is possible versus what might be attainable.
Yeah, maybe so. Though it's true. I'm getting the sense of two different readings here, both of which seem to me equally possible, that the pessimism in the book, what you see in the second paragraph, is the result of Edna's social constraint, that if she lived 100 years later, all of that would have been removed in some way. And I guess to me, what's interesting about the Darwinian perspective is that no, maybe what she's awakening to is something that has a dark side as well. I'm suddenly remembering there was once a critical article called Kate Chopin about her reading of that 19th century philosopher, famously pessimistic.
So, might at this point we summarize her awakening in at least one version of her awakening this way: that she finds her place in the universe, and she discovers that the universe is can be a kind of hostile and different place. A number of our participants have cited poems and other works. One of them cited Emerson. What this put me in mind of was that little Stephen Crane poem, "A Man Said to the Universe," and Crane, the man nice. Says, and the universe says something like, "Well, that doesn't evoke any particular response in me, So right, what? Right, You're right. Here."
It's good for the naturalist.
Yeah, very, very naturalistic. Is there? Yeah. Does that have something to do with her awakening?
I think it does, but usually when people write about naturalism, not so much me myself, but the usual view of it is kind of pessimistically determinist, as if once you awaken to the aspect of the universe that was not about human beings, this would be a kind of horrible void of some kind. And I think what's so interesting in the awakening is there are moments that, give us a sense of that side, but then there's also all this beauty and pleasure and, sensual delight, and it seems more about how they make it kind of a whole. Maybe the next quote speaks well to that, I think.
Yeah, well, that first paragraph does talk about the beauty and delight. It seems to be, that whole point that you just made seems to be well balanced in this passage.
Yes. And I think in the next one we see that sexuality does become one place where Edna is able to see both of those sides.
Okay, shall I read this one?
Please.
Edna cried a little that night after Arobin left her. It was only one phase of the multitudinous emotions which had assailed her. There was with her an overwhelming feeling of irresponsibility. There was the shock of the unexpected and the unaccustomed. There was her husband's reproach looking at her from the external things around her which he had provided for her external existence. Mm-hmm. There was Robert's reproach making itself felt by a quicker, fiercer, more overpowering love which had awakened within her toward him. Above all, there was understanding. She felt as if a mist had been lifted from her eyes, enabling her to look upon and comprehend the significance of life, that monster made up of beauty and brutality. Beauty and brutality, two of the opposites. There, here, a sexual experience gives Edna the same conflicted feeling produced by the music above and by her time in the sea. What links all of these things? Let's see what our participants have to say about that. And now we have come to that second of our framing questions. What is the role of sexuality in her awakening? So maybe we could put that on the table for our participants as well. But I do think that that last phrase, life, that monster made up of beauty and brutality, suggests here, a real, well, I was going to say confusion, but maybe it's not confusion. If she's comprehending the significance of life and she sees it that way, maybe she isn't confused. She's seeing it clearly.
Yeah, I'd be tempted to go that route.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's see, we've got some comments coming in from Meryl and Amelia. She sees the wholeness of life.
Yes, that's very nice. Exactly. And there is something powerful about that. There, above all, there was understanding.
Well, then this line of thinking makes the last scene even more confusing to me. I mean, if she's achieved a wholeness, if she's finding significance, why swim endlessly out into the sea? Let's see, Amelia is typing, and we'll see what she has to say as soon as we comes through. I used to talk about things coming over the wire, which shows how old I am.
We remember wires.
Yes. But I think there are scenes when her awakening is a very positive thing, and then there are scenes where they're depressing, and you can see why the awakening might push her towards suicide. But then there are also scenes that you would think would move her away from that. And that's what's so confusing, I think, about the end. Amelia writes, she seems to understand the external and internal. Her husband provided for her external, Robert provided for her internal. She's finally starting to see them as wholeness of her and her life. How would you respond to that, Jennifer?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I think I'm struggling even before that comment, which I like very much, to put the sense that she has arrived at a real understanding and wholeness together here with the crying, right, and all of these different emotions that are assailing her. So, I mean, she seems both in control and not fully in control of what's happening here. And I'm wondering whether the book is interested in whether, even if you can see these things fully, if the scales can fall, the mist can be lifted from her eyes, whether that really is a livable kind of realization, that it's something that you can just sit with and say, okay, that's what it is. It's a monster.
So Chanel writes, her awakening is so frustrating because she was unable to overcome the negative aspects of the life that she was finally truly seeing. Susan writes, I think that life itself produces conflicted feelings. Even with awakening and understanding, Edna may be overwhelmed by life and chooses to no longer live. Amelia writes, I like the description of life as a beautiful, terrible monster. It reminds me of the biblical depictions of angels and God, that they are beautiful and terrible. How would you respond to those comments, Jennifer?
Interesting. Wow. Well, we should remember that about angels, that they weren't always cute little babies with...
Lucifer was an angel.
Yeah, exactly. No,
Well,
yeah.
I think the point you made about her crying, that's what confuses me, because every time it seems that she's making a breakthrough, she's understanding something, then there's also this confusion. Edna cried. It was only a phase of the multitudinous emotions that had assailed her. Um, and then
It
she lists some
has.
of the emotions. So there's this one step forward, one step back sort of pacing in her awakening. Would that be fair to say?
Hmm. Maybe. I mean, I was thinking it might be more that it's not a kind of understanding that can be simply rational, that it's something that's felt. And to that extent, there's always going to be a feeling of acceptance and resistance of these facts at the same time. I mean, again, they're not really things, one can't walk around 24 hours a day thinking of humanity as worms on their way to inevitable annihilation. I mean, you might objectively think that's the case, but it's not a livable position. So I'm not sure it's a step forward and a step back so much as glimpsing these sides, from different angles.
So Amelia writes, the emotions are the stages of grief. And Merrill, crying does not necessarily connote confusion. It can also indicate an overwhelming understanding that touches the emotions. Yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yes,
true.
I
That's
like
true.
both of those very much.
Yeah. Well, shall we move ahead?
Yes, I think we should because we're finally getting to the climax here. All right, so here's Adele giving birth. This is too much, Adele cried. Mandalay ought to be killed. Where is Alphonse? Is it possible I'm to be abandoned like this, neglected by everyone? Dr. Mandalay paid no attention to Madame Ratignolle's upbraidings. He was accustomed to them at such times and too well convinced of her loyalty to doubt it. He was glad to see Edna, and wanted her to go with him into the salon and entertain him, but Madame Ratignolle would not consent that Edna should leave her for an instant. Between agonizing moments she chatted a little, and said it took her mind off her sufferings. Edna began to feel uneasy. She was seized with a vague dread. Her own like experiences seemed far away, unreal, and only half remembered. She recalled faintly an ecstasy of pain, the heavy odor of chloroform, a stupor which had deadened sensation, and an awakening to find a little new life to which she had given being, added to the great unnumbered multitude of souls that come and go. She began to wish she had not come. Her presence was not necessary. She might have invented a pretext for staying away. She might even invent a pretext now for going. But Edna did not go. With an inward agony, with a flaming, outspoken revolt against the ways of nature, she witnessed the scene of torture. So, what do we think about Edna's reaction here to the scene of Adele's childbirth and her characterization of her own such experience? I think I
Okay.
remember reading once is the same as Chopin's own, but that she had taken chloroform.
Hmm. Okay. We have some comments coming in. I think that this we can see that Edna was not a mother woman for sure in this passage.
In case you had any doubts.
In case, in case you wondered about that. Scene of torture. Yeah. And I think it was interesting, too, the way she describes the child to which she'd given birth. I mean, I don't know if many mothers see their bouncing newborn and think that she has just added to the great unnumbered multitude of souls that come and go. Uh, I'm not sure that that's...
Probably fair to say.
yeah, that's probably fair to say. Yeah, uh, I think that's a safe bet. Are we safe to see some Darwin behind that phrase?
I think we are. Maybe some Schopenhauer too, actually, now that I think about it. But I do think, even if mothers don't have that sort of thought, I do think they're, the contrast of a moment of, oh, what is this? Where am I? What have I done? What's happening here? I mean, those are not unusual responses.
No, it's not.
Probably at least as common as, oh, I'm having the most fabulous moment of my life, and it all makes sense now.
Well, children end civilization as you know it. Particularly that first one. Amelia
Yeah,
writes,
you don't even know that part yet. Yeah.
this reminds me of people who refuse to have children, saying that they can't imagine bringing them to a harsh world. Daisy from The Great Gatsby praying that her daughter is a beautiful little fool.
Hmm.
And this Amelia writes, this also reminds me of watching the Miracle of Birth video in college and being really freaked out.
Yeah, with a flaming outspoken revolt against the ways of nature.
And also the ways of your sex education course, too.
Yes, well, those are quite brutal.
So how does this, Jennifer, how does this relate to her reaction to nature? I mean, you've got the sea, she's seduced by the sea, but now she's revolting, outspoken revolt against the ways of nature.
Yes.
See, Chanel writes, it's interesting how detached Edna has become from motherhood. She's even revolted by it. So how does this figure into her relationship to the sea and to nature in general?
Well, I mean, there was a sense in the quotes that we had looked at that she was beginning to see nature in a fuller sense as having these aspects that, had no meaning for human beings, at the same time that there were other sides that were part of her opening herself to the world in a broader and, more beautiful and sensual way. But here, I think we really see this turn against all of it. Almost a kind of saying no. That she's opened herself to all of it. She's seen the monster, the beauty, and the brutality. And here she just says, why? Why all of this? What is it for? What is it for women in particular? Why the pain? It's important, I think, to remember Adele having, this kind of fairy tale relation to her mothering earlier in the book. And here we see, of course, the reality, which is just a bodily reality of what it really looks like to give birth. And so there's a huge gap between those two things as well.
Mm-hmm. And Meryl notes here she's making a non-literary comment. I remember personally thinking that childbirth was the most exquisite, penetrating pain ever, and I swore that I would never forget how I felt. To me, Edna is strong, that she stands by Adele. So what backlight does this throw on the role of sex in the novel?
Well, I think we might need to look at the next quote to really answer that one.
Okay,
we'll put sex and the mothering together.
Okay.
So, this is something that I think is really often overlooked when we read this book, this little conversation that Edna has with the doctor, and yet we know it had some relation to Chopin's own experience, so I like to spend a lot of time with it with my students. So, I can read it.
Read that one?
Sure, why don't you?
Okay. And are you going abroad? Perhaps, no, I am not going. I am not going to be forced into doing things. I don't want to go abroad. I want to be let alone. Nobody has any right, except children perhaps, and even then, it seems to me, or it did seem, she felt that her speech was voicing the incoherency of her thoughts, and she stopped abruptly. The trouble is, sighed the doctor, grasping her meaning intuitively, that youth is given up to illusions. It seems to be a provision of nature, a decoy to secure mothers for the race, and nature takes no account of moral consequences of arbitrary conditions which we create and which we feel obliged to maintain at any cost. Yes, she said, the years that are gone seem like dreams. If one might go on sleeping and dreaming, but to wake up and find, oh, well, perhaps it's better to wake up after all, even to suffer, rather than to remain a dupe to illusions all one's life. The question is, why is Dr. Pontellier the one who seems to understand best? She repeats at the end of the story. And what is he saying about how nature works? And Meryl has a comment that I think relates to this. Nature is terrible. This goes along with the beautiful sensual experience of sex. Now we have the terrible sensual experience of childbirth. Jennifer, how would you respond to that? And we've thrown the questions out there. Let's have some of our participants respond.
Are there? Yeah. I can jump in, or I can
wait for some more. Jump in right now. We're waiting. We got some responses. I have never seen this passage as a coming-of-age novel, but this passage pushes me in that direction. Well, that's an interesting comment.
Yeah. delayed Bildungsroman. I
Mm-hmm.
sometimes teach it in a course on that subject.
And
Well, it's a funny thing here. I mean, we're used to saying that, okay, nature wants more of the species to be made. But this funny notion that, so youth is given up to illusions, and we saw that earlier with Edna having these crushes on these inaccessible, sort of romantic men in a kind of classically teenage way. And that seems to be a provision of nature too, right? I mean, nature, there's nothing romantic really, I mean, in the teenage sense about nature itself, right? It's just doing what it does like a kind of a machine. But part of that process is to instill romantic ideas in youngsters who will then pair off and do what they need to do.
mm-hmm.
So it's that combination that I think is so fascinating here.
Yeah, let's see.
Nature,
Melissa writes.
putting it all together. Yeah.
Melissa responds to our first question. I think it's the doctor is older, but of science, and he therefore understands. Melissa writes again. He sums up her case so well. Meryl, this is the Darwinian part. Society creates its mores, but nature will prevail despite all. Amelia writes, I think Dr. Pontellier is older. As a doctor, he sees the real world, the great and the terrible. He's also a scientist in a sense, and I think Chopin would consider him as understanding her undertones. Cheryl makes her sound uncaring, just like an animal would care about its young. So here I guess the doctor is saying this is the way nature does things. Those illusions, that's part of nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the soul or fancy. It's the way nature works things out. Instinct.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's a relief for her to hear somebody say that. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean I always find that passage above the doctor's comment to be interesting too. How difficult it is for her to express what she's saying. Nobody has any right, except children, perhaps. And even then, it seems to me, or it did seem. I mean, she's pulled back and forth. She has this real loyalty to the children, but she doesn't want. I mean, she doesn't. She can't be the mother woman in the sense that Adele. I mean, Adele basically takes the romantic view of things and continues it on into mothering.
Mm-hmm.
She makes motherhood a kind of romance. I mean, with her flaming hair and all of those things, and it seems important. I think that I mean there are other points in the book. It's not that Edna doesn't love her children. There's just nothing romantic in her love for them. She has a kind of ordinary love.
Mm-hmm.
So these pieces don't fit together for her.
Well, shall we move ahead? We got
Yes,
a few
I
minutes
think
left, and I
we should.
definitely
Yeah.
want to get to the this scene, this
End
most
it.
baffling
Yes.
scene. So why don't I read that one, put it on the table, and we can begin to dissect it. Edna walked on down to the beach rather mechanically, not noticing anything special except that the sun was hot. There was no one thing in the world that she desired. There was no human being whom she wanted near her except Robert, and she even realized that the day would come when he, too, and the thought of him would melt out of her existence, leaving her alone. The children appeared before her like antagonists who had overcome her, who had overpowered and sought to drag her into the soul slavery for the rest of her days. But she knew a way to elude them. She was not thinking of these things when she walked down to the beach. The water of the gulf stretched out before her, glimmering with million lights of the sun. The voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander in abysses of solitude. All along the white beach, up and down, there was no living thing in sight. A bird with a broken wing was beating the air above, reeling, fluttering, circling, disabled, down to the water. Edna had found her old bathing suit still hanging, faded, upon its accustomed peg. She put it on, leaving her clothing in the bathhouse. But when she was there beside the sea, absolutely alone, she cast the unpleasant, pricking garment from her, and for the first time in her life, she stood naked in the open air at the mercy of the sun, the breeze that beat upon her, and the waves that invited her. How strange, how awful it seemed to stand naked under the sky. How delicious. She felt like some newborn creature opening its eyes in a familiar world that it had never known. I think we go on with that on the next slide. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, okay. There we go. And we repeat the last part of the quote there. So at this moment, does Edna appear defeated? And why does she take off her clothes? Okay, how do you want to handle that one?
And just
Yeah.
pause at this moment and imagine that you don't know what's coming.
Okay.
Just standing.
All right. We're plowing our through the novel for the first time, and we don't know how it ends. If she denies her children, she loses the reader's support. Going back to the doctor's comment, I suppose this deflates the romantic notion she has not lived up to her realistic partnership or motherhood. And we've got several other people commenting here. Let's see what we have. Yeah, I was baffled by that switch there. The narrator is telling us what we think the narrator is telling us what she thinks, and then the narrator says, "Oh, but she wasn't thinking these things." That really threw me off. Now we have some responses to the question about her clothing. She is casting off her old self, the faded self. So she is not defeated, at least not entirely. Amelia taking off her clothes reminds me again of baptism, coming fully with nature, the truth she's been on the edge of. And we have some more coming in. Okay, Jennifer, what would you like to comment about this?
Well, it's true that there are these already, there are some things about her thoughts, and obviously she's feeling the pressure of all of these different selves that she's being asked to be upon her. But at the same time, it does seem like Chopin emphasizes over and over, that she walks mechanically, right? She wasn't thinking these things. She even asks them, what they're planning to eat for dinner before she goes down to the beach. I think if we treated it as a kind of, she's decided to commit suicide, that doesn't seem quite right.
Mm-hmm.
She has these thoughts in her mind. She walks down to the sea. Being there with the sea, she thinks for the first time, of just taking off all her clothes. And there's something about that act, that she's to immerse herself fully in the water. No clothes on at all, naked, like those first beings, right, from the quote at the beginning about the very beginning of things. She is immersing herself more fully in everything that she's awakened to for the first time.
Mm-hmm. As Jennifer writes, Jennifer Alhorn, stripping away her old life and thoughts, the ocean touches all of her. Meryl writes, Susan writes, casting off the clothes could be taking off all of the pretenses of society. She wants to be just herself in contact with the sea, nothing between her and the sea. If there are no clothes, there are no divisions between her and life. Well, shall we move on to our to the final scene and our final slide? Okay, the touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. She went on and on. She remembered the night she swam far out, and recalled the terror that seized her at the fear of being unable to regain the shore. She did not look back now, but went on and on, thinking of the blue grass meadow that she had traversed when a child, believing it had no beginning and no end. Her arms and legs were growing tired. She thought of Léonce and the children. They were part of her life, but they need not have thought that they could possess her, body and soul. Perhaps Dr. Mandelet would have understood if she had seen him, but it was too late. The shore was far behind her, and her strength was gone. She looked into the distance, and the old terror flamed up for an instant, then sank again. Edna heard her father's voice and her sister Margaret's. She heard the barking of an old dog that was chained to the sycamore tree. The spurs of the cavalry officer clanged as he walked across the porch. There was the hum of bees, and the musky odor of pinks filled the air. Okay, our final question. Why do these old memories recur at this moment? Why does the terror rise and sink? It is important that while we assume Edna dies, we do not actually see this happen, that we only see her go on and on. And to return to our final framing question, why is the final scene both tragic and lyrical? So, life flashes before her eyes, as it's supposed to happen when you drown. If she is a broken-winged bird, she is at the mercy of nature now. Let's see what other comments come in.
Yeah, that certainly seems like the realistic way to understand what's going on here, life flashing before her.
So she was walking down to the beach without the intention of committing suicide. I think that's right. There's nothing in her behavior prior to this to suggest that. So this is, just not a whim, but a momentary thing that that she embraces right there on the shore. To answer the last question, I never really considered this a suicide. Suicide seems like giving up, and she seems very determined, not defeated. This seems more like a commitment to experience the truth she has been on the edge of, to know fully what her mind couldn't comprehend. Terror arises because people have a desire to live. It is suicide. By choosing suicide, Edna has regained some control over her life and the world around her. She doesn't think there is an afterlife. Okay, that's all. That's a lot of responses there, Jennifer. What do you make of those?
No, well, this is very typical of the conversations. I don't know if you folk have found the same thing, but they're very polarized kinds of responses to the end of this book. And some reminds me actually a little bit of the end of the Yellow Wallpaper, which I often teach at the same time. Like, this moment seems like a defeat, and yet it seems like a triumph, and it's certainly written not simply as a defeat. It has this lyrical quality that renders it a very beautiful, almost romantic moment. I mean, that's Chopin's choice in writing it that way. She doesn't make us feel simply, oh, how terrible that Edna's come to this pass. So I feel like as a reader, I need to make some sense of that. And I think Amelia's comment, that she is in some way fully facing and taking into herself all that she has realized, and that death is the consequence of that. I mean, that seems correct to me. She's facing it head on, nakedly, without illusions.
But is she swimming back to her past? I mean, the final paragraph there, she's having memories apparently of her childhood, and then of course, the senses of her childhood fill her. There were the hum of the bees, the musky odor of pinks fill the air. There are no bees out there in the ocean, and the odor of pinks aren't going to fill the air as she's swimming in salt water. So is she swimming back to her past in some way?
Yes, I mean, yes, I think the fact that memory comes up again is very important. I mean, the bees and the flowers, it's hard not to think of the workings of nature there. It's almost like the birds and the bees, right? I mean, in its creative mode of producing new life, not simply nature as a vehicle of death, as it may actually be in this scene. But if we think back to that early moment, I mean, that was the summer that she walked across the meadow, aimless and unguided. That was when it was possible to imagine going on and on and on, and to give that this romantic spin that it seemed like it still had for Edna at that time. So I feel like almost the book in a way gives her back that romantic sense of nature and this limitlessness as possibility rather than something that's terrifying at this last moment. And I think there is a way in which that's something that art is capable of doing. I mean, we might think here about Mademoiselle Rice's piano playing, right? That's another way in which one can kind of safely experience these limitless passions because they're contained within a work of art. And so Kate Chopin does that with Edna. I mean, this is not something that we could ever imagine in a real life suicide, right? It's a literary moment.
Right. And Cheryl writes, it's her version of heaven. And Amelia writes, my students who feel they understand her reason to commit to death tend to portray her as a woman out of her time, that this wouldn't have happened if she'd been born in modern times. Cheryl says this is a religion, and Pat agrees that many of her students see the same way that Amelia does. Do your students see it that way, Jennifer?
Yes, I think they do. I think they do. And I think it's exactly for that reason, actually, that I try sometimes to push things like the Darwinist reading, because I feel like it allows the text to be enduringly provocative. I mean, not simply to say, oh, all Edna's problems would be solved and all the things that she realizes, we found a way out of all those things, because I hope as I've presented it today, I don't think these are things one finds a way out of. I mean, these revelations about life, these are not going away anytime soon. So, she may be the victim of Victorian conventions, but I think the book is timeless because it goes beyond being a story about 1899.
Right. Well, here's another very interesting literary connection. Edna's exit echoes Nora's exit in a doll's house.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, that's right. It's there are a lot of stories written around this time where the woman disappears off stage at the end. And in a case like this, you assume she's dead, but or even, I even think of something like the end of Dreiser's Sister Carrie, where she's just rocking in her rocking chair. And again, some people think it's a defeat, and other people think that she's going on and on. It's very enigmatic. It's not a happily ever after or a absolute defeat plot to be able to go on and on and on.
Can we see the novel as something of a tug of war between romanticism and naturalism? Or is that too simple?
I think that's actually very useful. I mean, the funny thing about naturalism is that it has romantic aspects. I mean, Frank Norris, probably the most well-known American naturalist writer, wrote an impassioned plea on behalf of Émile Zola, the most famous naturalist, as a romantic writer, not a realist. So I think Chopin's actually one of the writers who can remind us about that. Yeah. And I just say, too, I just noticed this comment about the piano, and I do think that's really smart.
Well, let's give Susan the last word here and ask if we have any final questions or final comments. Not exactly the last word if anybody has anything to add. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone a little bit over, so let me wrap things up here. Please check out our Facebook page. Like us on Facebook. Let us know what you think about our work. Let me thank Jennifer for giving us a wonderful seminar tonight. This was a baffling novel to me, and I think I'm beginning to understand it, and I hope our participants are too. Thank you very much. A wonderful job.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful for me too. And I want all of my students made comments like this.
I want to thank our participants for their intelligent, enthusiastic participation this evening. Emerson came up earlier, and if you're interested in Emerson, join us next Thursday night at 7 p.m. when we're going to look at Emerson. We're going to cover several of his essays and try to make sense of that great American thinker, and rather baffling at times, but I think we'll have a good time figuring out what Ralph Waldo was saying to us. Please remember to submit your evaluations, and once you do that, you'll get your CEU letters. I want to thank you again so much, ladies and gentlemen. Please join us next week, and good evening.